All right. Greetings, folks. Apologies again about today, and to now have done this a second time. The first time around was uh, on the UK, our first case study. This is our, I want to say, I don't know, next to last, I don't know. Content chapter here on non-democratic regimes, chapter 8. This one we'll do for today, Tuesday. We'll do chapter 9 on Thursday of this week 8 of the semester. Um, I should be there without fail. But today I'm just not feeling very well. I'm very lightheaded. I don't know why. It's somewhat scary. I don't know if it's related to my car accident. I haven't felt this way ever, so here we are. But anyway, I've only got about 40 slides here. I've trimmed it down quite a bit. I'm going to hit the high notes. Um, the links that will come up in here I will not click on, because again then YouTube takes my lecture down. But I'll post those in the T-Learn, so they'll be accessible to you. But anyway, we're going to go through this point by point, so there's no need for me to read it now. Talking about non-democracies, right? So step 1, defining a non-democratic rule, right? Where we in class, we bat around responses to this question or this statement here. If things get far off track in our country, we need a leader who is willing to break some rules if that's what it takes to set things right. I would hope that most of you would disagree with this. We could go through history. We could even look at the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, really changed our conception of the presidency, in no small part by pushing the envelope. Uh, According to many, I mean, I'm old, but I wasn't around in the 1930s at the time. Arguably breaking rules, bending norms. We had a recent president in this country, arguably break some rules too. We could go through a laundry list of examples. I'll give you a few throughout the lecture here of rules that are broken by willing leaders. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, especially if it goes against whatever rule book, otherwise known as a constitution, that's meant to guide the political regime in question. But anyway, more properly defining a non-democracy, you have one here: a political regime controlled by a small group of individuals who exercise power over the state without being constitutionally responsible to the public. Right. So you've got a cadre of leaders, usually with one person at the top of a limited hierarchy, but who can basically do what they want. Right. Um, Regimes that lack any sort of democratic control or are sometimes called authoritarian. It doesn't necessarily mean that such regimes are illegitimate. I mean, they might be in our eyes, but by the people who live in such regimes, right? You might live in a place with individual freedom completely restricted, competition limited to non-existent, but you still might follow the rules. You still might embrace this awkward legitimacy of the regime. Why? Well, we'll get to that towards the end of the collection of slides here, but because you're likely coerced, right? I mean, people obey the rules in North Korea not because the rules are meant to be obeyed. It's because if they don't, they might end up, in a prison labor camp, right? For a regime to be legitimate in the eyes of its people doesn't necessarily mean that it's legitimate in the eyes of the rest of the world, right? We're talking about different definitions of legitimacy in this way. Um, I'll say something here. The textbook does too, distinguishing authoritarianism from totalitarianism, right? Not all authoritarian regimes are totalitarian. And the fact of the matter is, totalitarianism really, I mean, I'm not a historian on political theory, but there was a real famous article. Larson was alive, I think, when it was written, but he was too young to have read it when it came out. But I think it was someone who was high up in the State Department for the Reagan administration. Janine Kirkpatrick, I think was her name. She might still be alive. I think she was a professor at UCLA, but made a distinction between authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes, basically just saying that totalitarian regimes were communist and they were bad, and that the United States could support authoritarian regimes that weren't communist. Basically, it was a way of threading the needle to define totalitarian worse than authoritarian. Um, in my line of work, in my field, we still use the term, but I try not to, or I try to be very specific when I do. The standard definition we still use in political science today, you have here a centralized regime possessing some form of strong ideology, hence the communism, that seeks to transform and fundamentally absorb the state, society, and economy using a wide array of institutions. Fair enough. But the problem is, so the term really came about mid 20th century and was applied to both Nazi Germany and Soviet or Stalinist Russia, both driven by ideologies, both highly centralized, both really sought to fundamentally absorb the state, society, and economy. True, but very different, along very different ideological lines, right? I mean, the Soviets fought the Nazis alongside the Americans, the Brits, and the French, etc., right? So, to say that only communist regimes can be totalitarian is a misnomer, to put it very diplomatically, right? So anyway, you won't hear me dwell on the term totalitarianism, but I will say this in the context of this chapter, this lecture. Any totalitarian regime, like any authoritarian regime, is likely non-democratic, right? By definition. Just to give you some brief history, as I just did on the previous slide, maybe a little more detail here. The Soviet Union under Stalin, very much the entire economy was under control of the state. Very much a cult of personality in the case of Stalin. This is why the first real legitimacy crisis that occurred in the Soviet Union is after Stalin's passing. Hitler's Germany, again, another totalitarian system. This one not built on communism, but rather on fascist ideology. It was also very centralized. But as fascists tend to do, there was much more of an ethnic component here, with the aim of creating an ethnically homogenous state, right? There were other social organizations that were seemingly free from state control, but in practice very much under the Nazi Party's control. The economy remained private, but as tends to happen in fascist regimes that often embrace corporatism, which I'll talk about down the road too. The economy nominally remained private, but no business venture was successful without ties to the Communist Party. Mao's China, right? China immediately post-communist revolution, the state really controlled most of society as well. Coercion, systematic terror was employed to maintain order. Mao was elevated to this godlike figure even while he was still alive. However, Mao's totalitarian regime didn't modernize China as Russia seemed to modernize, or industrialize is maybe the better term, in the mid 20th century. Led to economic stagnation, international isolation, really until about the last quarter of the 20th century. Um, Moving along, here's some key factors for totalitarian regime success. Often boiled down to a cult of personality, systemic use of terror, and exertion of state control over economic, political, and civil society, which is to say, just about the whole of damn state and society, right? How that works. Uh, Again, if I were to ask you for an example of a totalitarian regime today, a safe bet might be North Korea. Remember that little factoid? Put that in your back pocket and leave it there. Here in the case of North Korea, we have dynastic rule, right? No one gets to vote for who the supreme leader of North Korea is. It's a bloodline, right? The state really controls the whole of social, political, and economic life, right? Whether that is whether what you study, what you do in life, the media, and again, there's no independent civil society, much less opposition to the regime. Arbitrary arrests are pretty normal. I made mention of a labor camp once already, and the labor camps in North Korea, as far as I understand, I've never been to one. are pretty equal opportunity for anyone under the sun within the borders of North Korea who doesn't, love the regime might end up a victim of it. Well, a specific victim of it. I think just about everyone who lives in North Korea is a victim of the regime in one way, shape, or form. But again, another topic for another day. So let's look at some origins and sources of non-democratic rule. We would flesh this out in class, so I'll just click through the bullet points here, and I'll talk about these point by point, starting right now. Um, we used to think that modernization, development, whatever we want, whatever terms we want to nebulously and vaguely use here, would lead to urbanization, higher education levels, the creation of a middle class, which would then demand democracy. And there are lots of historical examples in the 19th and 20th centuries of this happening. Um, and 50 years ago, you had a lot of fuddy-duddy political scientists thinking that it was just a matter of time before a country like China would follow the same path. Well, China very much has economically developed, very much urbanized, with better levels of education and increasingly a middle class. But I'm not holding my breath waiting for China to just become a democracy overnight, right? The fact of the matter is modernization can reinforce non-democracy, right? And we'll talk about China when we get to China Week here around the corner. But modernization can be a pretty disruptive and uneven process. It doesn't just lead to democracy like my forerunners in the field of apolitical Scientology used to tell us. Right? Again, urbanization can really shake up a society, and so can technology. But it doesn't mean that everybody benefits from these in the same way, right? Not everyone benefits from economic and labor market development and shifts. And as a matter of fact, when you have a non-democratic regime, it's even easier for the leadership, which is to say the state, to literally pick winners and losers in such developments, right? Social values and gender relations can change as well. And really, we'll talk about all of this again when we get to China. I've got a very good clip from recent years from the PBS NewsHour about urbanization and how it's really disrupting families in rural China in particular, right? So, the new thinking again is that non-democratic leaders who were likely there before modernization took place continue to promise stability and order, and I think China lives up to this characterization quite well. Elites are important, really, in any political regime, but when you have a non-democratic regime, it's a lot easier for entrenched elites to just hang on to power, right? There are a lot of ways that this unwillingness to share power can be cultivated and maintained. The resource curse would be one of them. This term has come up in class a time or two. Um, Without us going into great detail, but we will down the road. I think next time when we get to Russia. But the resource curse is this theory of development in which the existence of natural resource in a given state, in practice, is a barrier to modernization and democratization, right? And the easiest way to explain this is if your state doesn't need to tax its populace, right? If the state can line its pockets and elite leadership can personally line its pockets, without taxing the people, well, then why listen to the people, right? It's a very convenient way to ignore democracy, even in countries that function as illiberal democracies, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. It allows the states, such states, to pretend to be democracies while in practice not being democratic at all, right? It really leads to unequal development that stunts civil society. We could look at examples around the globe. I think I mentioned earlier this semester in class the case of Equatorial Guinea, Spanish colony until 1968, has a very high per capita income, GDP per capita of over $100,000 a year, yet is arguably one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's very small geographically. It, its population is very small. So you have basically just a small elite group of people with close personal ties to the president, air quotes included, who are very wealthy, and lots of other people who aren't. And that wealth comes entirely from oil exports, right? And because these resources, like in the case of oil, are not so portable, while they're in the ground, control of resources requires controlling the state, right? So again, we see lots of examples of very non-democratic states with lots of resources. And it's not just oil; it could be diamonds, it could be cobalt, things we need to make our stupid smartphones, et cetera, et cetera. That can really entrench bad leadership, right? Giving an example from the text, I won't go into nearly the detail that the text does, but you could look at the different paths that late 20th century Zimbabwe and South Africa have taken, and these are two countries with similar colonial paths, we'll say. Um, you know, um, Both very much in the news in the late 1990s. South Africa, very much more diverse place. Both countries had been under European white leadership that was very systematically, racist and oppressive. But South Africa had a much more diverse populace, not just black and white, but hundreds of ethnic groups within the black population. You had whites who had come from Holland, who had come from the UK, who had indirectly come from Portugal via Angola and Mozambique, who didn't all get along with each other, right? So democracy was a way that really enabled a much more diverse country than even we realized in South Africa to inch forward. It was also South Africa still is Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is the better term, most industrialized country, which helped. So it didn't necessarily need to democratize prior to modernization. Zimbabwe, very poor country that's had a very bad leader, has been under very bad leadership since it gained independence. I forget the exact date, late 1970s, 1980, led by the same guy, Robert Mugabe, for about 40 years. He's since been removed and died, luckily. Um, but very much the politics of Zimbabwe boiled down to black and white. And Robert Mugabe was the rebel leader that led to the revolution that overthrew white rule, which not a bad thing. However, he just basically turned Zimbabwe into his own private piggy bank. And although Zimbabwe doesn't have a lot of oil, it does have a lot of other mineral resources, particularly diamonds, that enabled elites in Zimbabwe to become rich and stay rich. But anyway, I'll come back to Zimbabwe in a second. Thinking about civil society might still be present in a non-democracy. It just can kind of depend on how leadership, the elites, want to engage with that civil society to the point of even taking advantage of it, right? Um, Elite leaders can encourage civil society to embrace non-democratic values, right? And this is really the worst of populism, right? Again, a word that's come up a couple times throughout the semester. Not It's hard to nail down what is populism as an ideology, what its ideological content is, I guess, but it's more of a practice, right? It's emphasizing hostility towards elites and an established state and economic institutions and favors greater power in the hands of the public. But that's a very easy bill of goods to sell to the public uh, by a populist leader, right? A leader who might even say rise to power democratically, like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who really has no intention of working within the institutions of the state, right? And this can really manifest itself either because of a charismatic populist leader, or a charismatic populist leader might come about because such non-democratic tendencies exist prior in civil society that can lead to ethnic favoritism, xenophobia, anti-immigrantism, right? Certain anti-religious views, be that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Protestantism, anti-Catholicism, you name it, right? This can happen. A good example today would be Hungary's Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who's been in that position for quite some time, recently re-elected in 21 or 22, I forget when. This link is just to a short clip, maybe 3 or 4, 5 minutes long from Deutsche Welle, German television broadcaster, but in English, talking about how the left and the right have united, excuse me, to attempt to electorally oust Viktor Orban, but have not been successful. In the case of Hungary, it's really, I think, populism is manifesting itself as a rural versus urban division there, although I'm not an expert on Hungary. But anyway, let me keep moving because I feel like I'm just talking in circles here. We can talk about international relations and non-democratic rule, right? International actors can very much influence a given country through foreign occupation, imperial legacy. You lots of examples of European powers backing non-democratic forces within former colonies. We can look at the Cold War era specifically, where there's very much an ideological uh, layer or variable to consider. Right, the Soviet Union obviously very much had a vested interest in maintaining direct influence over Eastern European states that weren't formally part of the USSR, right? Like Hungary, like Bulgaria, that again were not part of the Soviet Union, but were very much under the influence of the Soviet Union. We can look at the United States and Iran. We'll talk at great length about the US's role in Iranian 20th century history when we get there. Chile in 1973, this would be a good example of the United States embracing this authoritarian versus totalitarian um, interpretation of political life. 1970, there was a socialist government elected very democratically in Chile, and on September 11th of 1973, the United States basically backed a military coup against that democratically elected leader, Salvador Allende, and a military general took over the country and led it until the late 1980s. Very much not a democratic regime, very authoritarian in the minds of U.S. administration after administration. This was an authoritarian regime, not a totalitarian regime, so the United States put up with it. But good example of the United States sacrificing its own ideals for its own political and economic expediency. But anyway, we could look more recently at China and Russia and their activities in Africa and the Middle East. China, in particular, is perfectly willing to invest in countries like Zimbabwe to build roads, build railway lines in exchange for diamonds. And China just does not care at all about what type of regime a state has. Right? The United States today, European countries today like to tell you that they'll only say loan money to countries that live up to certain levels of democracy and respect for human rights, etc. China and Russia do not do such things, right? So, whether or not China wants to sell natural gas or petroleum to a given country, trade with it, say like Venezuela, as Russia and China do at present, there's just no concern for democratic rule in either place, right? I've shown you this map before in class. This is a good one. It'll come up again in class. But we could look at foreign occupation and imperial legacy in Africa. Looking at a country like Angola here in southern Africa, former Portuguese colony, very large, very ethnically diverse, that has a lot of oil. And it's also been under control of one party since its independence in 1975. And the two major political parties basically fought a civil war from 1975 to 2002. And to this day, the longtime president has since died. He died earlier this year in Barcelona, of all places. His family still runs the country, the Dos Santos family, and never have there been free and fair elections. And the opposition party is just delegitimized again and again and again by the ruling party, because again they fought a civil war for the better part of 30 some years. So again, thanks to the Portuguese for drawing these borders, putting differing ethnic groups together, sprinkling in oil, which was discovered in the back half of the 20th century in Angola, and you've got just the scene is set for non-democratic rule. And we could look around this continent at lots of other examples that follow the same historical path for similar reasons, right? I told you I'd come back to Zimbabwe. This is a photo I just took from the textbook. The textbook has a little vignette that describes how the Chinese are perfectly willing to invest in Zimbabwean infrastructure in exchange for diamonds. But again, this does nothing but entrench elite leadership. It's not to say that no benefit through infrastructure is felt by the wider populace, but this relationship I do not see um, cultivating Zimbabwean democracy anytime soon, right? We can think about political culture and non-democratic rule. The old thinking was perhaps that democracy is a Western or a Christian construct, and that such values of individualism and secularism may not translate into other regions. Again, the textbook has made this point a few times. I do not disagree. We can find democracy around the world. It's not that it's unique to the West, and we can find Western countries today that aren't doing a very good job of living up to their democratic values either. But I think the better way to understand culture and democracy, or non-democratic rule for that matter, is this last bullet point here. Culture shapes the form of democracy. It does not determine its presence or its absence, right? Um, so I'll just leave it at that. I think that sense pretty much speaks for itself. Let's think about forms of political control in non-democratic regimes here. We can look at democracies and non-democracies around the world. The first collection here is percentages of countries. So we can see the world is mostly partly free, or mostly free or partly free, to the tune of about 3/4 of the countries around the globe. But if we then disaggregate this by region, you can see clearly that some regions do democracy better than others, right? And again, this is not to say that the 86% of European countries that are full on democracies are perfect democracies. There is no perfect democracy. We've talked about Germany, we've talked about France, we've talked about the United States, we've talked about the UK, etc. Again, I'm not saying that this is perfection, but we see more democracy in Europe than any other region around the world, right? And if we look at this by population, which I also think is quite interesting, um, when this is taken into account, the percentage of people who live in non-democracies rises. I think this has a lot to do with, of course, China being the world's most populous country and the world's largest non-democracy by every stretch of the imagination. So how do authoritarian leaders maintain control? Why don't the non-democracies democratize? Here are three major reasons why, right? Authoritarian regimes depend on coercion, co-optation or co-option, and personality cults, and I'll quickly go through all three right now. We can look at coercion, by which I mean compelling individuals by threatening their lives or livelihoods. Again, I've talked about North Korea already. Um, using fear to discourage opposition, and this could be anything from fear of losing your job to fear of losing your life, or harm befalling your family members if you don't toe the party line, right? That would be targeted violence. We could look at indiscriminate violence, which might be I don't know why this is popping into my head, but because it's before you were born, so it's like it didn't happen. But the Tiananmen Square protests in June of 1989, very much indiscriminate violence on the part of the Chinese state against student protesters who were seeking democracy, democratic change in China at the time. Um, Surveillance is often used, and this day and age, you people have grown up with smartphones in your hands. I wish people were more conscious of the fact that it's a little spy in your pocket. But we could look at the spread of technology. I think 50 years ago, the thinking was technology would help bring about a demand for democracy. I think this day and age we've crossed the Rubicon, and a state like China will use technology to entrench itself even further. Right. Um, that said, we can look at the limits of coercion as well, right? It can undermine regime legitimacy. I don't think that's going to happen in North Korea, but it might be happening right now, right? October 2022 in places like Iran, where there are massive protests going on right now. I'll mention Iran in a sec. Russia, I think, is the legitimacy of the Putin regime has long been secretly called into question, and I think it's just a matter of time before that really hits the fan with widespread protests. So again, if the legitimacy erodes, this might then bring about widespread grievances and protests. Obviously, it's costly to maintain such levels of coercion, economically, politically. But as long as there are some people who benefit from the regime, whether that is people aligned with leadership of a given country, or even just soldiers and members of police forces who are willing to carry out the orders, whether that's in a place like Syria or Venezuela, Russia, Iran, China, it's Myanmar, you name the non-democratic place. As long as somebody's benefiting enough, that coercion is going to be hard to dislodge. We'll put it that way. Co-optation is the term the book uses. Again, I prefer co-option, but anyway, nobody asked me. This is a process by which individuals outside an organization are brought into a beneficial relationship with the state. Right? You're basically just making offers that people can't refuse. Not so much because they fear for their safety, but because you can make certain people rich. Right? You just selectively provide benefits to certain groups, usually business interests within a state. And that is how you create dependency, right? You make certain pockets of the population dependent on the state for certain rewards, and then everyone who depends on those people just, the co-optation has a trickle-down effect in ways that Reaganomics doesn't. But the two forms this could take is first and foremost likely corporatism, which is a term I've used a few times throughout the semester. Used it once earlier today, talking about the Nazi regime in Germany. But it's basically when the state just picks winners in the economy, right? We have this one producer of paper goods and one producer of this type of food product and one producer of say, the automobiles and everyone who runs these companies has a direct line to political leadership, right? That's a corporatist system. Um, they can make or lose money on their own. It's not a communist system, but it's picking and choosing of economic winners and losers in the system. Clientelism usually happens on a more micro level, but this would be like, say, the people who run the businesses that are linked to the state then might hand out certain favors to certain people at work, who then might do the same with the people down below them in the hierarchy. And of course, the stakes get smaller and smaller and smaller the further down the hierarchy you go. But that is how you co-opt a society to maintain a non-democratic regime. So anyway, I think I just described all this and shouldn't have. I forgot I had the slides that followed. But here again, corporatism. Just to remind you again, limited number of organizations to represent the interests of the state. And again, usually we're talking about businesses in this context. Spain and Portugal, very much from the 1930s to the 1970s, did this, even by creating their own labor unions, right? Spain and Portugal were not fans of true labor unions, as in like defending the rights of workers, but they liked the window dressing of having syndicates, which is just another word for a labor union, that were state approved, and those who ran such unions were in the pocket of the state, and they made sure that the workers stayed in line, right? Um, we could look at a more social setting in China. There are a limited number of religious groups that are permitted in China, and they exist with the blessing of the state, and they're under control of the state, right? Which is not the case. Um, which shouldn't be the case in a democracy. You should have true freedom of religion in a democracy. Clientelism, again, I think I gave you the breakdown here, usually a more micro level. But again, it's got to start somewhere, and that usually starts with the elites who are bought off in effect by the state, kept in line by the state, and often participate in just draining the state of its assets and resources, right? Ruled by theft, term kleptocracy that's often used in conjunction with corporatism and clientelism, right? And again, we can talk about Zimbabwe's mineral wealth, which I already have twice. Russia's energy interests, which we'll talk about during Russia Week at great length. But again, this clientelism can occur at the micro level, macro level. When your state runs on it, your state is likely not a democracy. Lastly, personality cults. We see examples all around the world where the people are asked, instructed, forced to legitimize the rule of a charismatic leader, usually a charismatic leader who's presented to the public as the true embodiment of the nation, who has endowed wisdom and strength beyond the average individual. And then, of course, the media is used to reinforce this image even more so today, again, with the stupid smartphones in our pockets. We could look at the supreme leader of Iran, not so much a charismatic leader. I think, again, evidenced today by protests around Iran after the state arrested and murdered a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman for not properly wearing a veil. That was earlier this summer, earlier this semester, might have been August or September even. And you got protests going on throughout Iran, led by teenage girls in particular, right, against a very non-charismatic supreme leader who I think is slowly losing control of his non-democratic regime. We could talk about Vladimir Putin, who again, very democratically elected several times over, air quotes, who, again, well, I won't talk about Putin now because we'll talk about him when the time comes. But again, I think the personality cult very much applies to North Korea, where you have the last three leaders listed there going back to the revolution in the mid 20th century. Models of non-democratic rule. We could look at personal or monarchical rule, military rule, etc. I'll look at these point by point here as quickly as I can because I am about to wrap up. Usually we're talking about rule by one leader. I was just talking about Iran. Would have been a good example with the supreme leader who is chosen by religious leaders. We could talk about the Kim dynasty again in North Korea, which is a bloodline. But the main tool of control here is patrimonialism, where a leader depends on a collection of supporters within the state who gain direct benefits in return for enforcing the ruler's will. Again, clientelism, corporatism, a lot of overlap here with patrimonialism. But it's, leaders choosing those who surround them and making sure that those people will do their bidding to maintain the system. That's a bit different from military rule. The two can overlap, of course. But we could see military rule come about often after a coup d'état. That's French for a coup d'état, golpe de estado, right? A military coup where the military takes over a country. Usually follows periods of unrest, and military leaders swoop in and promise stability. Examples, I've mentioned Chile in the 70s. That time of socialist leadership from 1970 to 1973, the economy definitely took a hit in Chile for lots of different reasons. The military stepped in and promised to stabilize the economy. Egypt had a de facto military dictatorship until the Arab Spring got rid of Hosni Mubarak. There were democratic elections. The Muslim Brotherhood won. The military then stepped in and said these people are too Islamist. And so bye-bye democracy, as imperfect as it was, as briefly as it was in Egypt. But Egypt's been under military control for the last decade and change. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, suffered a military coup in January of last year. And it's very easy for military leaders to rely on coercion to maintain control of the country, right? May focus on technocratic rule. I've used the term technocratic in class once before. Um, but this is where you assign leadership based on those who have rational, objective, and technical expertise to solve the country's problems, basically by ignoring what the people want. And by the way, all of these technocratic leaders are handpicked by whoever the leader is, whether it's the military, whether it's one singular person, et cetera, et cetera. Non-democratic, to say the least. One-party rule, again, can be a consequence of the previous two, but as it sounds, a single party monopolizes politics, banning any competition from even competing for power. Oftentimes, particularly in a totalitarian regime, and I use that term carefully, um, if no area is untouched by the presence of the party, then that's, I think, when totalitarianism, the term best applies. Again, tools of control, co-optation, corporatism, clientelism, patrimonialism, again, could be the case too. Good example, best example in the business right now would be China. For a newspaper to even exist, it's got to be linked to the Communist Party, and the party chooses who does much of anything in such settings, right? So no civil society to speak of. We could look at theocracies, right? Fancy word that means rule by God, with religion forming the foundation of the regime. This can be, more traditional religious legitimacy. It could be in the form of corporatism. The fact of the matter is, no pure cases of modern theocracies exist. Saudi Arabia kind of looks like one, kind of smells like one, but if you know your Quran, monarchies are really anathema to leadership in the Muslim world. So whether that's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Morocco, whether it's Jordan, countries that have a monarchy often draw the most ire from our most ardent Islamic fundamentalist friends, because again, monarchies very much violate the notions of what, again, a certain reading of a Quran would tell you an Islamic theocracy should look like. The closest thing to a theocracy around the world today would be the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's mostly theocratic with a lot of illiberal democratic trappings. And I'll leave it at that because I'm going to say more about Iran in a second. Um, Illiberal regimes. This will be a term that we're gonna use and bat around a lot more between now and the end of the semester. Um, Different terms apply here. We call these hybrid regimes, electoral authoritarian regimes, semi-democratic regimes. What I mean by, or what is meant by illiberal regimes in this context, is any regime that might try to look like a democracy, but really isn't, right? It combines the democratic with the non-democratic. And unfortunately, this is really growing in prominence around the world, right? Again, Russia has a democratically elected president in Vladimir Putin, who's been elected now 4 times over. When he wasn't, he was prime minister. He manipulated the constitution to be reelected almost in perpetuity at this point. Venezuela um, is for all intents and purposes a non-democracy now, but if you asked anyone in leadership in Venezuela, they tell you, of course, it's a democratic regime. But what happened was, say, when Nicolas Maduro was first elected after Hugo Chavez died, Hugo Chavez died in 2013. Venezuelans were pretty fed up with Chavismo even before Chavez died. Maduro was his handpicked successor, waltzed his way to election in 2013. Uh, I think riding a wave of Chavez nostalgia, but by 2015, uh, the people voted for the main opposition party to take over the unicameral legislature in Venezuela, constitutional legislature in 2015. What Maduro then did is turned around and said, I don't like the opposition controlling the unicameral legislature. So I'm going to hold a referendum and call for the creation of a parallel legislature outside of the Constitution. And I'm going to recognize that as the real legislature. And the opposition abstained, right? So the only people who voted in favor of creating this new legislature, and that's the legislature that exists in practice. Sorry, until elections in 2020 that were rigged, and the party in power, Maduro's party, the Socialist Party, again took control of the constitutional legislature. So then we didn't need the new legislature anymore. But hopefully, I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but hopefully you see, when you don't respect the rules of the game, as democratic as you might pretend your system to be, that's a non-democracy, right? When you don't respect the rule of law, you don't respect free and fair elections, when executives just accumulate more and more power of their own while limiting civil rights and individual freedoms, what you have is a non-democracy in practice, right? I mean, what would have happened in 2018 when Democrats took control of the House and the Senate in the United States if then President Trump had said, I'm going to hold a referendum to create a new Congress, right? Or if in elections, if Democrats lose the House and the Senate, and I bet money they're going to lose the House, maybe not the Senate in 2022, if President Biden then comes out the day after the elections and says, I'm going to create a parallel Congress, right? That is not democratic, right? And that's what illiberal regimes do. They pretend to be democracies until it's too inconvenient, and then the non-democracy steps in. So in some last three slides I think I have here, I won't say much more because most of it's going to be repetition, but it's the good thing to take away is we have more democracies now than we saw around the world 30 years ago. The last decade has not been good for democratic regimes in general, and it's not so much that country after country is reverting from democracy to something non-democratic. It's just that the institutional guardrails that protect democracy are eroding, right? Which I think is how we see countries become less free in the process. So anyway, summary here, non-democracy refers to a lot of things. We've covered the bases. We've talked about things that can reinforce non-democratic rule, how non-democratic regimes maintain control, types or categories, if you will, of non-democratic regimes. Again, things not looking great right now globally. A term that's not discussed in the chapter, but one that I like to use. This hyperlink here takes you to just a short 4-minute clip from CNN, a show I quite like with Fareed Zakaria, a political scientist originally from India, PhD from Harvard. He's a smart dude, where he talks of democratic backsliding and uses examples from around the world, like Turkey. I've lived in Turkey. It's nominally a democracy. More journalists are in jail in Turkey than in any other country in the world, right? That's not a good sign of democracy or for democracy or of Turkish democracy. And then lastly here, this last clip is a 20-minute one on Venezuela. It's from Last Week Tonight with John Oliver from about 2018, I believe. Not very uplifting, but Oliver does a pretty good job of walking you through how Venezuela used to be a pretty solid democracy, one of the most robust democracies of South America, to now arguably one of the least democratic state in the continent of South Africa, or South America. Sorry, my wife's from there. I know it's not in South Africa or Southern Africa, but anyway. Beside the point, I'm done. I'm tired. I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry about today again. But that's that. Hope to see you Thursday. Bye-bye.